Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Sunday school class for Ely'sburg Alliance Church. As you can see, I'm not Mike Palachek. You can argue whether or not I have more or less hair than him. He's probably about 40 pounds lighter than I am right now, and he's away. He is at the funeral at the memorial service for Dick Knoebel. So this morning I'm going to be doing the Sunday school class, and the lesson that is for us today is called the Good Shepherd, and it comes from a passage in Ezekiel 34, 1 through 16. So before we get started, I just want to ask the question, who do we think were possibly the shepherds in Ezekiel? So let me just say that shepherding is the dominant image in the scripture for spiritual leadership. Can anybody think of other places in the Bible where it talks about shepherds?
Wise men and shepherds.
The wise men and the shepherds, right? Absolutely. But can you think of one where shepherding is compared to leading a group of people?
David.
David, right? Yep. David's spoken of as the shepherd of Israel. Not only was he a real shepherd, but he's the shepherd of the people of Israel. Anybody think of anything else? I'll give you a hint. The book of John, what Jesus said.
He's a good shepherd.
Yeah, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, right? Okay? And so that's why this is called the Good Shepherd. And then we're going to discuss later on in 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter himself says to the fellow elders among you, be good shepherds, shepherd God's flock. So there's this image of shepherds that's pretty powerful. Has anybody ever encountered a real life shepherd? So they still exist. They still exist in Israel, believe it or not. And Bethlehem, when we were there, a lot of shepherds, a lot of sheep. Diane and I went to a conference in Wales when we were in France. And we got up to, and Wales is on the corner of England. If you think about England like this, Wales would be out here. And man, the place we got to was full of sheep and those old stone walls and everywhere. And you would drive, and it was like being in Yellowstone with your vehicle. You'd stop for the flock to pass by. And there'd be an old guy with his staff, and there'd of course be a dog or two, right? Because and the reason that they're shepherds is because sheep need shepherds, and the way that sheep graze is they have to be constantly on the move. If you put sheep in a pasture, they're going to eat it down to basically the bare nubs pretty quickly. So they have to be moved on. Sheep are really dumb animals, they say, okay? All right, so the question for us is, the shepherds in Ezekiel, were they the actual shepherds? Were they the kings of Israel and Judah? Were they the leaders of the nation? So, hey Donnie, we've been wondering about you. Glad to have you here. So, Donnie, we're talking about shepherds in Ezekiel, and we're looking at Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 1 to 16. So we are going to find out, okay? All right, there you go. Now, who was Ezekiel? Ezekiel was one of the prophets, and he's considered one of the major prophets. I mean, he's an important one. Other major prophets? Anybody know who else would be a major prophet in the Bible?
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, of course. Even greater than Jeremiah was probably Isaiah, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Who else is a major prophet? book we all love to read. Got some crazy stuff in it.
Daniel.
Daniel, right, Daniel's considered a major prophet. And I thought there were 5 of them. Well, anyway, that escapes my memory right now. All right, so Ezekiel was a prophet who wrote prophecies against Judah, this is kind of crazy, after they had been taken into captivity in Babylon. So people are already taken away by the Babylonians, and they're in exile, and Ezekiel's saying, this is what the word of the Lord says. So, and I think one of the reasons for it is because there needed to be an explanation for what had happened. Because people are always going to blame God for everything, right? And so, Ezekiel had to kind of set the record straight. And so one of the things he said was that there's problems with your leadership. So you know, in any organization, if it's not run well, and especially if the people at the top of the organization are not people of integrity, then you get into all kinds of trouble. You've all seen the papers. You've all seen fire company after fire company with a treasurer who's taken the money and tried to run. And eventually that stuff all catches up to you, right? Right? Which is why I gotta say, I love the fact Jason's wife is our bookkeeper. She's very, very careful and methodical. And everything that we spend here at the church is tracked. Everything needs to be justified if it's called into question. I mean, there's also a lot of grace for stuff. But, you know, we have to be accountable. And it all starts with the top. So, and especially back in those days, just as it was all the way up through to about 100 or 150 years ago, only the rich were educated. So you have a lot of smart people who don't even have a grammar school education. And they can't read and they can't write. So if you have a bunch of people who don't have the knowledge, and you have a few people who have the knowledge, then it's a little bit like when you're when you are going to court or taking somebody to court. You have a lawyer working for you, and your opponent has a lawyer working for them, and it's like they're talking at a different level and hemisphere than you can really understand, right? It's a little similar to what was going on back then. Only the wealthy could have the private tutor to give their children an education. Okay, so Ezekiel, he speaks against this. Okay, so let's look at the first passage, Ezekiel 34, 1 through 6. All right, starts out. The word of the Lord came to me. All right. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not the shepherds take care of the flock? Now, I have that this comes from God himself through the prophet. So this is something that's common in languages where people believe they hear from God. They'll speak something called an oracle. Okay? So, do you guys remember studying the Greek tragic play Oedipus when you were in high school? Don't remember it. All right. There was an oracle to Oedipus that you're going to kill your mother, and you're going to kill your father, and you're going to have a child with your mother. And so you read this Greek tragedy, and I used to teach it to 10th graders in school. And once they got into it, man, they were on the edge of their seat. So is this thing going to come true or not? And then by a bunch of different things, it actually comes true. And when he figures out what happens, he's completely undone. I mean, he's a wreck of a person. Can you imagine this happening? Now, he didn't know that he was doing any of this, but it happened, okay? So whenever I think of the word oracle, I always go back to my time almost 40 years ago when I was teaching my students, and we learned about oracles. And there was an oracle at Delphi in Greece, excuse me. And that oracle would say, this is what Apollo, the god, says. People would come and they would offer an offering, they'd give a sacrifice to feed the oracle, and then the oracle would speak and give them a message from God. So this isn't just happening in Israel. And here's the thing we have to think about as we think about oracles and prophecies, is oracles and prophecies were fairly commonplace in the ancient world. They are still commonplace in the rest of the world. We call it now the majority world. In fact, in a church in Africa, the person who has the most power is not the pastor, but the prophet. Because the pastor is supposed to guide the people, but the prophet, he hears a message from God. He hears a message from God about whether the harvest is going to be good or the invaders are going to come and attack. Did you get the idea? The prophet says whether or not this is going to be a successful marriage or there's going to be problems, whether or not this couple's going to be able to have a child, all these kinds of things. So people want to hear what a prophet has to say. All right, so what he says in this first section is, woe to the shepherds who take care of, who feed themselves, and not the flock. And that's what he says. Woe to you shepherds of Israel who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, it says in verse 3, clothe yourselves with wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. So you eat the curds, I have in parentheses fat, use the wool for clothes, and slaughter the choice animals, but did not take care of the flock. Now this is interesting. According to what I learned about shepherding when I was in Israel, and I talked to a guy who had lived there for a number of years and spoken with shepherds, is shepherds were contracted by the owner of the flock to bring a certain percentage of the sheep back. It was understood that he would be eating some of the sheep as he goes along. That's how he would survive. Okay? Now, at the same time, the shepherd's taking care of the flock. So the shepherd's living off the flock, which is okay to do, right? It's part of the way that people did business back then. But what Ezekiel's saying is that woe to you, which means there's going to be judgment coming on you, because you're neglecting the flock and you're just using it. You're not taking care of them, okay? And then you eat the curds or the fat, which would mean perhaps the fat from the sheep milk, and it could also be the fat from the animal itself. Because I don't know if you've ever lived in a culture where you don't eat a lot of fat. When you don't eat a lot of fat, or you go on one of those Weight Watchers diet, you start to get a hankering for fat. You know what I mean? I mean, you like it. So, like, you know, if I'm on one of those diets and I have a glass of whole milk, man, that tastes good. You know what I mean? Okay, or cream, oh, it's magnificent. Maybe not good for my stomach, but boy, does it taste good. Oops. Having trouble here with my... Can you go back a slide, please, Jason? Thank you. Okay, so this is what he says in verses 4, 5, and 6. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured, which is what you would expect a shepherd to do. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. you have ruled them, what's going on here? Harshly and brutally. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I have animals at home. So I try not to be harsh or brutal with my animals, right? Because that would be animal cruelty. In fact, you can get yourself in more trouble for animal cruelty than you can sometimes for human cruelty in this day and age, right? Okay. In fact, my little dog, I have a $60 speaker that goes under my pillow at night. Because when I can't sleep, I listen to an audiobook. I set the audiobook or the speaker to turn off after half an hour. I'm usually out in 5 minutes. Okay? This morning I was getting ready, I heard this. What's that sound? What's that sound? Go around the corner, there's the dog lying in the hallway, and my speaker is not a speaker anymore. And he's had a great time with it. What did I do? Oh, Bruno, come on! I didn't smack him around. You know why? Because he's a dog, and I'm the dummy who left it out there, right? And so he can get to it, and he's going to eat it. That's on me, right? Okay, but what he's saying here is that these shepherds ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. When they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Now, I have harshly ruled not just shepherds here. I really meant to say not just sheep here. Forgive me for that. But pretty soon you can see that this is something that we call in literature an extended metaphor. So a metaphor is when you have a comparison between two unlike things. Okay? The classic metaphor in literature is she is a rose. Okay? So how is a woman a rose? Beautiful, right? Soft, delicate, fragile. You got to take care of a rose, right? You want got thorns on the side, be careful. So people will write, they will not just say she is a rose, they will write a whole poem. They'll extend the metaphor about how their lady is like a rose. Okay, get the idea? You can think of some metaphors for guys that you like. We probably can't mention them in church, especially online at the same time. But you get the idea. So it seems that what's going on is that this is an extended metaphor. And back to our earlier question, who are the shepherds in this passage? It's not necessarily shepherds in the fields, but he's talking about the rulers of Israel. And the rulers, especially of Judah. Okay, let's see if my thing works now. There we go. Okay, so, it really does work. Okay, so now, then you have a second part, and what he says in verse 7 is, therefore you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. Okay? Now once again, he begins with an oracle. Ezekiel speaking the word of the Lord. Okay? So, and then he says in verse 8, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord. And do you guys know that in your Bible, the word Lord is in all capitals? It's a crazy configuration. It's in all capitals, but it's smaller. Does anyone know why that's done like that? Okay, so the reason for that is because the Jewish people, out of respect for the commandment that says you shall not take the Lord's name in vain, they will substitute the word Adonai in Hebrew, which means Lord, for the actual name of God, which is Yahweh. They think it's Yahweh. Original Hebrew doesn't have the vowel markings, just has the consonants. So you're not sure exactly what it is, but everybody over the years has accepted that it would follow that this is the name of God. But a Jewish person which is the common word for Lord or Master. Okay? Now in our Bibles it's in all caps because we're saying, all right, so we're going to say the word Lord out of respect to our tradition, but we're going to make sure that we capitalize it because we believe that this is God Himself. Right? So begins with oracles, comes from the Lord or from Yahweh. Based on my existence, he says, so as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and so has been plundered, become wild food for all the animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but care for themselves rather than my flock, therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. Okay, so, once again, based upon my existence, whereas I was in, surely as I live, because you have not been a shepherd. By the way, the shepherds are compared to wolves in Ezekiel 22:27. That's a pretty harsh thing to compare shepherds to, right? Because shepherds are supposed to take care of the sheep, and what does a wolf do? He eats the sheep, right? He lives off the sheep. And so that comparison, that metaphor actually works, right? Terrible, though. Hey, man, you're abusing these sheep here. You shouldn't be doing that. Okay, because you have not been a shepherd, the flock has been destroyed. Now, what you notice is you have something in Greek, or excuse me, something in Hebrew poetry, which is called parallelism. They use this a lot, where you have the same sequence of words arranged, and then you learn a little bit about what the sequencing means by the interplay of them. So you have here, because you have not been, because you have not. Get the idea? So you have because, and then you have the reason because. What I'm saying is that if you start looking for it in the Psalms, you'll see that Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme, but it uses this thing called parallelism, where you have line A will say an idea, and then line B will say another idea, and usually it's closely related to line A. Okay? Anyway, point is, you've not been a shepherd, flocks destroyed, you've not searched for lost sheep, but you cared for yourself instead, which is a pretty difficult indictment against leaders, right? I don't know. I don't want to stand before God one day and have Him say that about me, right? I wouldn't think you want to stand in front of the owner as a shepherd and say, you didn't do your job. You were deficit in your duties. So what he says in verse 9, therefore, you shepherds, now once again, hear the word of the Lord, you have all caps, hear the word of Yahweh. This is what Yahweh says, I am against the shepherds. Can you imagine the owner saying that I'm against you? I guess I could. So, Don, you were a boss, and if you had somebody who was stealing from the company, then you would put yourself in a position where you'd have to be against them, right? You would have to fire them, you might come after them for damages, you might testify against them, but you would be against them, right? You would hold them accountable. So this is what God says, I'm going to hold these accountable. Not only that, but I'm going to fire them. I'm going to get them out of there. I'll remove them so they can't feed themselves, I will rescue my flock from their mouths. Now, how is God going to rescue his flock? Is he going to send new shepherds? That's the question. It would certainly make sense, right? I'm going to get new rulers in place, okay? So, I will rescue my flock from their mouths. It won't be food for them. I have down here, consider the historical context of what he's saying here. So, if he's talking about shepherds as the leaders of Israel, and the fact that the Jews have already been taken into exile in Babylon, modern day Iraq, right? They've crossed the desert, they're there. God's saying the reason for this is because of these leaders. And then he says, it won't be food for them. The leaders will no longer be living off of the people or off of the flock. The leaders won't be in a position to do that because they won't have the power. Okay? So that's a pretty frightening thing to think about in terms of leadership. All right, there we go. So, now let me just take a pause here and say that a good shepherd should guide his sheep. You probably all know it, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, right? He makes me lie down in green pastures. So here we have, God is my shepherd, I'm not going to want because God takes care of me. I lie down and rest in green pastures. Now, I'm going to say, this passage has always amazed me. If you understand where they herd sheep in Israel, it is oftentimes in places that are barren. In fact, when I see places where they shepherd sheep in Israel, my mind immediately goes to a place like the Mojave Desert. I don't know how anybody lives or gets food there at all. Now, I was there for a couple of weeks, so I understood this, that there are places where there are springs and there are streams, there are places where the vegetation is protected, and that's where the grass grows. There's certain times, there's certain places, there's certain times of year when the grass is there, and the shepherd's going to guide the sheep into the green pastures. But let me just say, it's not like Ireland or Wales, where you have water coming off the Atlantic all the time, and Ireland's called the Emerald Isle because it's always green, right? It's always green because all that water's coming off the ocean, constantly raining there, it rains 2 or 3 times a day. It's very similar to Alaska. If you're in the southern part of Alaska, along the archipelago where we landed in Juneau, it's just raining all the time. In fact, Skagway, I think, gets more rain than any other place in the United States. Constant rain. And what they say is that is a Pacific rainforest. Alaska rainforest, well, you got warm water coming off of the Pacific. You have lush vegetation, only it's beautiful pine trees and all the different things that are in the forest. Magnificent because there's water. But in the desert, there's not a whole lot of water. So God finds places, or the shepherd finds places for people to be in green pastures. So he leads me to quiet water so I can drink. Sheep won't drink out of water that's not still. So they'll just refuse. So you've got to get them to the quiet waters. And then he restores me as a sheep, even my soul. And he leads me in right paths. He leads me in paths of righteousness, we say, right? For his name's sake. But in ancient times, the right paths were the paths that would take you from point A to point B, and you wouldn't end up falling off a cliff and dying. Because portions of Israel are like the cartoons we used to watch with, Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. There's those canyons and those cliffs, and you fall off if you're not careful. And if you make a right turn, and the thing goes left, and you're going off, and it's terrible. So that's the way that it was. So the right path for righteousness, he's leading them in the way they can get where they're supposed to go on their journey, which is another metaphor in itself. And he does this for his name's sake, which is interesting to me. He does it for his name's sake. He does it because it's his nature as God, as a good shepherd, to guide the flock, right? All right. And then in verse 4, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Now, the valley of the shadow of death is a place where you have, once again, think of the Roadrunner and the Coyote, where you have a canyon that comes together, and you have to walk through it. And as you're walking through the bottom of it, the valley of the shadow of death is the place where the sun doesn't shine. Okay? And it's a place where it's very, very dangerous. It's slippery, it's dark, but that's the only way through. Okay? But God is going to guide you through the valley of the shadow of death. And then it says, I won't fear any evil because the shepherd is with me, and your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Does anyone know what the difference between a rod and a staff is? A staff has a crook, so it's a rod straight. So one is an offensive, one is a defensive weapon. So the rod's basically a billy club. Okay? So you use that to fight things off, right? Okay? David, of course, had a sling and rocks. And that's how he got good enough to be able to kill Goliath. He was, of course, throwing his rocks at wolves and bear and lions and everything else that was trying to come after the sheep, protecting them. But the staff is what has that crook on the end, and that's what you use to get sheep and to bring them out of the gully or the ditch they've fallen into. You bring them back up and you put them on the right path. Okay? Notice how the sheep need to be guided. Okay? All right. Now he switches the metaphor here at the end of Psalm 23. I'm fed in the presence of my enemies. My head's anointed. My cup is overflowing. So if you think about Bedouins, who are nomadic people who would have shepherds, think about the early patriarchs. They were all Bedouins. They were people. The Middle East to this day is a place of incredible hospitality. It is their honor to welcome you. If you don't accept their food and it's lavish, you are dishonoring them. For them not to welcome you as a guest is tantamount to shaming the family. So they are going to put on the Ritz for you every time that you come around. So I'm fed, which makes sense, even in the presence of my enemies. My head's anointed, my cup is overflowing. Now that means, you know, back in the day, we had our ancient version of a server or a servant at a table. And in fact, in those days, you wouldn't be at tables, you'd be sitting on mats on the ground. And you'd probably be lying down or sitting or seated Indian style. Okay, so you're sitting there. So if you're going to get some more wine or liquid refreshment, it's easier to have somebody come and pour it for you. So the fact that your cup is overflowing means that place where you are taken care of. That's a good shepherd. Okay, now, then, in this passage, Ezekiel, here we go. Ezekiel says in verses 11 to 16 that God will be the good shepherd. So once again, he starts out with the same pattern in verse 11. For this is what the sovereign Lord says. So this is the third time now. This is what the Lord says. So the idea is that this isn't just Ezekiel. This is coming right from God. I'm his prophet. I'm his spokesperson. I'm speaking the truth. Okay? I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. Have you ever had the boss come in and say, put it down, I'll do it myself? You ever had the boss do that? I have. I had my parents say that to me when I was a child. I appreciate your efforts. Thank you for trying to cut the celery. But they need to be in cubes, not in triangles. You go play, I'll do it myself. But it's okay. No, it's okay, you know? I remember one time when I was a little boy, we had just moved into our new home. I was like 5 years old, and they had grass seed on the dirt in front of our house. And so I had watched people when they plant grass seeds, that they take a metal rake and they run it over the top of the dirt before they put the grass seed down. So as a 5 or 6 year old, I reasoned that was the right thing to do. So I'm out there in the front yard by myself with the rake. Mom comes out, Andrew, what are you doing? What are you doing, honey? Just trying to get the grass so that it grows sort of. You to play with in the backyard. You go do that, okay? Stay away from Dad's grass, okay? Get the idea? So I will do it myself. I'll search for them, and I will take care of them. No. Notice what God's going to do. God's going to search for them. You'll see that come up later on, and I will care for them. As a shepherd who is doing his job, he looks after his sheep. And then he does this when he is with them. I want to read this to you. It says in verse 12, as a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they are scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. Now after when he's with them, I saw the idea of incarnational ministry. Anybody know what that means? Incarnational. We might talk about it when you grew up in church. So the word carn is the word for flesh. So in flesh ministry. When Jesus is born, we call it the miracle of the incarnation, God becoming flesh, right? Okay? So, what they taught us in school to be a pastor was they said, your presence is important. Whether or not you are a good pastor or not, it depends in part on whether or not your ministry resembles that of Jesus. Jesus came down from heaven. He walked among the people. Remember, he was in the flesh. So in ministry, you better be with the people. So here you have it in Ezekiel. It's in verse 12. So, yes. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. Okay, and then he says at the end of verse 12, I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. So can you just see a day of clouds and darkness in the Mideast when it becomes so dark because of a thunderstorm and the clouds coming off of the Mediterranean Sea where thunder and the lightning, and when that comes, man, what do the sheep do? Right? They scatter, okay? then the shepherd is the one then who brings them back. That's what it says in verse 13. But once again, I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries. I will bring them to their own land. Now he's talking about people there, but then he says, I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines and all the settlements of the land. So I have down here, I will gather them to their own land. I will pasture them, which is of course a shepherd term, on mountains, ravines, and settlements. I was trying to think about, why would he say mountains and ravines? Why would he do it? So, you know, a mountain obviously is up, right? So where's a ravine? Down. And then settlements, I was thinking, well, you got the wilderness, or you have nature, and you have the towns too. So I think it's the way for the Lord to say he's going to be with them everywhere. Mountains, ravines, the towns too. I'm going to be with my people wherever they are. I'm going to have my presence with them. There we go. Okay. So then he says in verse 14, they will be in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. I don't know. I tell you, some of the most beautiful places I've ever seen are in the northern part of Israel. Because when you think about the nation of Israel, the bottom part is a desert. I mean, it's pretty rough. Okay? And then the northern part, though, it's beautiful. Forests and rolling hills, and just, I mean, lovely, lovely place. So you think of a mountain meadow in Pennsylvania in the springtime. And that's the way northern part of Israel is. It's gorgeous. Okay? So, what he's saying is that when God brings his people back, he's not just going to bring them to the southern part of Israel, but also to the northern part. Listen to what he says. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in a rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. And then I myself will tend my sheep and have them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. So I'm going to take care of the sheep in such a way that they're fed and they're watered and they go to sleep. Right? Any animal likes to take a nap after they eat. Right? My dogs especially. Feed them, half an hour later, I love it because I get a little bit of calmness and quiet in the house after they have eaten. Okay? But then he says in verse 16, let me see, he will search for the stray, search for the lost, bring in the strays, bind up the injured, and strengthen the weak. So he'll do everything that the shepherds aren't. Now this is interesting. He says at the end of verse 16, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. So why would God destroy the sleek and the strong in the flock? Well, once again, I know very little about shepherding, but my thoughts are that the sleek and the strong are not necessarily desirable, because what they do is they're pushing the other sheep out of the way, and they're taking all of the food for themselves. And if they're sleek, there's something wrong with them. So the idea is that the sleek and the strong sheep are representing the sleek and the strong rulers in Israel who were just a little too slick. I had dealings with a businessman the other day, and I learned more about him. Just a little too slick. Okay? In fact, Jason, I want to talk to you about that in a second. But it was very interesting that truth came out about this fellow eventually. So God will shepherd the flock with justice. So I was watching a TV show at one point, and somebody had almost had an affair on their spouse. They went to a psychologist to ask him what they should do, and what the counselor said is he said, I think you ought to come clean and tell your spouse how close you came, because it'll be much better. Because secrets like this always have a way of coming out. That's what I found out. And the scriptures make it pretty clear. Your sin's going to find you out. What's done in the darkness will be exposed in the light. So be a person of integrity who walks with righteousness. Okay. I'm losing my time here. I was kind of afraid of it. Can we have the next slide, please? All right. So Jesus is the good shepherd. In John 10:10-18, I'll look at the scriptures. But Jesus gives his life, and that's abundant life. I have come they might have life, and have it to the full, or have the abundant life, not death, as the thief or the robber does. Jesus sacrifices himself for the sheep, unlike the hired hand. Jesus knows his sheep and is known by the sheep, modeled after the divine Father-Son relationship, which is what Jesus says. It's similar to my relationship with the Father. The Father knows the Son, and the Son knows the Father. Jesus has other sheep, not of this pen, us, the Gentiles, and he will bring them in also. And then they will listen, and there will be one flock, one Catholic, and Catholic means universal. But if you say the Catholic Church or the Universal Church in the Apostles' Creed, people get really confused. So that's why we say Christian Church, rather than one holy Christian Church. Okay? There will be one flock, one Universal Church, meaning the Christian Church, as I just said. In other words, I'm going to take care of my people. What I found over the years is I work with people from different denominations and different faith traditions that they love Jesus and they believe his word is true, and the Holy Spirit's in their hearts, and we are brothers. You don't have to worry about small points of doctrinal difference. It's minor stuff. But the major stuff is in place, and that's a wonderful thing. Okay, then 1 Peter 5:2-4. He says to the elders, be shepherds over the flock under your care. Watch over them, because do this because you're willing, not just because this is your duty. Don't lord it over them. In other words, don't lord your authority over the church. You become a person who guides them, being an example to the flock. And then just as the shepherd is rewarded by the owner, the chief shepherd will give you a crown of glory when he appears. So that, my friends, is the end of our Sunday school class. Thank you for being here today. You can see this image of a shepherd is dominant throughout the scriptures. Again and again and again and again. So we don't want to ever forget that. Okay? So, would you please pray with me, and then we'll be dismissed. Lord, thank you for this chance for us to look at your word. I pray you would imprint in our hearts the things that are important. Thank you, Lord, for these who are here, those who are watching online. I pray you would give us insights from your Spirit as to what we should retain. And I pray, dear God, that you be glorified by this teaching of your word.